John Edward Robinson is one of the most notorious and violent serial killers in U.S. history. His crimes were notable not only for their brutality, but also for the unique methods he used to lure his victims. Born on December 27, 1943, in Cicero, Illinois, Robinson was the third of 5 children in the family. His father was a violent alcoholic, and his mother was known for her strict parenting methods. From an early age, John had problems with discipline and the law. Even in school, he often got into trouble, and his reputation as a poor student and undisciplined teenager foreshadowed future problems. Robinson's criminal career began with minor offenses, such as theft and fraud. He was repeatedly sent to prison, but each time he managed to avoid serious punishment, which probably contributed to his sense of impunity. In 1969, he was arrested for stealing $33,000 from a medical practice, but received only a suspended sentence. Throughout his life, Robinson created fake companies, engaged in counterfeiting and securities fraud, which also led to his arrests. He could have been just another con man, but at some point, he took his crimes in a completely different, much more sinister direction. In 1984, Robinson first came to prominence in connection with the disappearance of 19-year-old Paula Galen Godfrey, whom he had offered a job at one of his fictitious companies. She disappeared without a trace, and it soon became clear that her death was the first in a series of murders. Robinson used his personality and status to lure women into a trap. He disguised his intentions as help and job offers, and then, using his victims for his own purposes, killed them, often with violence. Robinson later used the internet, posing as the master, to find women willing to participate in BDSM games. This made him the first serial killer to use online chat as a way to lure his victims. Robinson's crimes became particularly cruel and sophisticated. Not only did he manipulate his victims, but he also remained elusive to the authorities, which allowed him to continue his activities for decades. Dozens of women fell victim to him, including Lisa Stasi, Isabella Lewica, and Suzette Troughton. Each disappearance left behind only traces in the form of fake documents or false stories that Robinson told those around him. Some of the victims, such as Godfrey and Stasi, disappeared and their bodies were never found. Robinson's mysterious and secretive nature meant that he was not caught until 2000. He was arrested at his farm in Kansas after one of the women filed a complaint against him, and during a search, the bodies of 2 of his victims were found in chemical barrels. The discovery of these remains was a turning point in Robinson's case. During the investigation, other bodies were found, including in Missouri, and investigators determined that Robinson was responsible for a series of murders. Robinson's trial was one of the longest and most high-profile in Kansas history. He was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death for the murders of Troughton and Levitsky. Joseph Paul Franklin, whose real name is James Clayton Vaughn Jr., was born on April 13, 1950, in Mobile, Alabama. His life and career became the embodiment of racist ideology, cruelty, and criminal activity. Franklin is a serial killer and white supremacist who committed a series of murders in the late 1970s and early 1980s. He was convicted of several murders and assaults, and also confessed to the attempted murders of Larry Flint and Vernon Jordan. However, his actions and motivations were only partially understood and revealed during his trial. Franklin's early childhood was marred by violence and abuse. His father, a World War II veteran and butcher, left the family when Joseph was still a child. His mother, who was known for her strict parenting methods, was also unable to create an atmosphere of care and love, which left a mark on his psyche. Franklin claimed that he experienced serious emotional and physical trauma during his childhood, which slowed his development and led to personality problems. In addition, from an early age, he showed an interest in racist ideologies. In high school, he became interested in the ideas of Nazism and white supremacy, and later became an active member of the National Socialist Party of White People in the Ku Klux Klan. Joseph's transformation into Joseph Paul Franklin, symbolizing his identification with the ideology of racism, foreshadowed his future crimes. In 1977, Franklin began his criminal career, committing murders and assaults motivated by his racist beliefs. He was obsessed with the idea of cleansing the world of those he considered inferior, especially black people and Jews. His crimes were brutal and calculated, often symbolic in nature, targeting interracial couples, Jews, and other minorities. One of his most notorious crimes was the 1977 murder of 42-year-old Gerald Gordon, when Franklin hid in the bushes near a synagogue and opened fire on worshippers, killing Gordon and wounding several others. In 1978, Franklin attempted to assassinate Hustler magazine publisher Larry Flynt. He used a rifle to shoot Flynt, who had become Franklin's target for his publication of interracial sex. Flynt survived the attack, but was left paralyzed from the waist down. This attack on Flynt, as well as his subsequent confessions to other crimes, such as the Oklahoma City murders, made Franklin widely known to law enforcement. Franklin's arrest came in 1980 when he was apprehended in Florida. His racist tattoos and habit of visiting blood banks became an important part of the investigation, ultimately leading to his capture. During his trial, Franklin confessed to several murders, including those he committed with a firearm, as well as the attempted murders of Larry Flynt and Vernon Jordan. He was found guilty of the murders, as well as assaults on various victims, which led to his sentencing to life imprisonment and the death penalty for the murder of Gerald Gordon. After his conviction, Franklin attempted to escape from prison and also attempted to claim that he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, that his motives and actions were the result of mental illness. Despite these attempts at defense, he was sentenced to death, and his subsequent appeals were rejected. Franklin remained on death row in Missouri, awaiting his execution. His final days were overshadowed by public debate over the fairness of the death penalty. He was executed on November 20th, 2013, and his death was quickly announced. Tommy Lynn Sells was an American serial killer whose actions and confessions attracted the attention of not only law enforcement agencies, but also the public. Born on June 28, 1964, in Oakland, California, Sells faced many difficulties from childhood. His biological father died when he was 11 years old, and according to Sells' recollections, his childhood was marred by violence and emotional trauma. His mother was an unmarried woman raising 5 children, and it was in this difficult family that the future criminal's path began. Early in life, Sells witnessed and was a victim of cruelty. When he was only 7 years old, he experienced severe stress when his brother or sister died of meningitis. These events, according to him, influenced his perception of the world and marked the beginning of his inner chaos. At the age of 10, Sells began abusing alcohol, and at 14, he began wandering around the country and encountered drugs. This ultimately led to his early arrest in 1982 for public intoxication. During this period, he was also diagnosed with mental disorders, including bipolar disorder, which may have exacerbated his inability to control his impulses. Sells did not receive psychiatric help, which only exacerbated his problems. He continued to lead a vagrant lifestyle, traveling across the United States and committing crimes. Throughout his years in prison and numerous arrests, he continued to claim that his crimes were the result of both his personal trauma and the influence of social isolation and alcoholism. Despite this, his behavior became increasingly aggressive and dangerous, ultimately leading to his involvement in a series of violent murders. By his own admission, Sells claimed to have committed his first murder at the age of 15 in Mississippi, when he allegedly broke into a house and killed a man. However, this crime was not confirmed. Nevertheless, his confessions to other murders committed in the 1980s and 1990s were more convincing to investigators. He claimed to be responsible for the murders of dozens of people across the United States, often targeting people he considered vulnerable. Many of his confessions were later confirmed by investigators, While others were not found to be credible, Sells was also convicted of several murders committed in various states. In 1999, after the murder of a 13-year-old girl in Texas, he was arrested. This crime was the catalyst for his arrest and also led to an investigation in which Sells was convicted of other murders. In his confessions, Sells repeatedly claimed that he had killed more than 70 people, but only about 22 cases related to his activities were officially confirmed. Investigators also found that Sells traveled around the country and that his victims were linked to his vagrant lifestyle. During the investigation, Sells also made numerous confessions that later turned out to be false or inaccurate. For example, he recounted crimes that took place in locations where he could not have been at the time, or events that could not be corroborated. Despite these inaccuracies, investigators were still able to establish his involvement in numerous crimes. Tommy Lynn Sells was sentenced to death for the murder of a 13-year-old girl and other crimes. His actions and confessions left a deep mark on U.S. criminology, especially in the context of the study of serial killers. Sells remained an enigmatic figure until the end of his life, and his psychiatric diagnoses only emphasized his restless and destructive behavior. He was executed in April 2014 in Texas after spending more than 15 years on death row. At the time of his execution, Sells expressed no remorse or admission of guilt. Terry Anthony Blair, born on September 16, 1961, was an American serial killer who was convicted in 2004 for the murders of 7 women in Kansas City, Missouri. Although Blair was only convicted of these murders, investigators believe he may be responsible for additional unidentified crimes. His criminal activities left a deep mark on U.S. criminal history, and his family environment was also linked to crime, making this case even more tragic and multifaceted. Terry Blair was the 4th of 10 children in his family. His mother, Janice, suffered from mental illness and only received an education through the 9th grade. Blair's family was linked to numerous crimes. In 1978, his mother shot and killed her common-law husband, after which she was convicted of second-degree murder and given a suspended sentence. Blair's brother, Walter, was also involved in violent crimes, including the murder of several people, and was executed in 1993. Other family members also had criminal records, including charges of murder and assault. These tragedies and the unstable family environment may have had an impact on Blair, but he still became one of the most violent criminals of his time. From an early age, Blair was exposed to violence and neglect. He showed signs of aggression in his youth, and by the late 1980s, his criminal career had begun to take shape. In 1982, he was convicted of the murder of Angela Monroe, but after 21 years in prison, he was released on parole. Blair did not take advantage of his new start, and his life continued to spiral into crime. He committed violent assaults and murders of women, often targeting prostitutes, which indicates his cruel and manipulative tendencies. Blair's most notorious crimes occurred in 2003 and 2004. In September 2004, police discovered the bodies of 2 women in an abandoned house, which led to an investigation that uncovered several more victims. All of the murders took place in the Prospect Avenue area of Kansas City, which allowed investigators to focus their attention on Blair, who had been released on parole for the Monroe murder and was a suspect in other crimes. Blair matched the descriptions given by surviving women who reported his rapes and assaults. The investigation identified Blair as the prime suspect. Although the evidence against him was mostly circumstantial, DNA analysis confirmed his involvement in the murder of one of the victims. Blair denied his involvement, claiming that it was not murder, but just consensual sex. However, the evidence told a different story. In 2004, he was charged with 8 murders, 1 assault, and several counts of rape. Prosecutors offered a deal, waiving his right to a jury trial in exchange for not seeking the death penalty. In 2008, the court found him guilty of murdering 6 women and sentenced him to 6 life sentences without the possibility of parole, Blair's trial attracted public attention because many of his victims were women working in prostitution, and their murders reflected the cruelty and inhumanity with which Blair acted. His refusal to admit his guilt only emphasized his lack of remorse, making him particularly dangerous to society. During his years in prison, Blair continued to contest his conviction, but his appeals were rejected. Despite all the evidence, he never fully admitted his guilt. This continued until his death in a prison hospital on May 11, 2024, at the age of 62. Anthony Joe Lorette Jr. was born on October 1, 1951, and became known as a serial killer and rapist who committed crimes for nearly 3 decades. His criminal activity began in the late 1970s, when he began hiding in various parts of the United States, murdering and raping women. Lorette was a man who covered his tracks and frequently changed his place of residence, which made it difficult to investigate his crimes. He operated by posing as different people while committing brutal murders that remained unsolved for a long time. One of Lorette's first known murders was a crime committed in 1976 when he checked into several motels in Marathon, Florida, under the fictitious name Mike Watson. On August 20th of that year, he broke into the home of 26-year-old Jeanette Mickey Wade when she returned from work. Lorette attacked the woman in the kitchen, stabbing her several times and then finishing her off. He then left the scene of the crime and fled the city, but despite the description given by a witness, he was not caught. Shortly thereafter, on August 23rd, in St. Petersburg, Florida, Lorette murdered 52-year-old Betty H. Branton, who worked for a cemetery service. He followed her home, broke in, and stabbed her to death, leaving the murder weapon stuck in the victim's body. The body was discovered by Branton's co-workers, who became suspicious when she did not show up for lunch. Despite his brutal crimes, Lorette continued his activities in different parts of the country, committing murders in Kansas City, St. Charles, and other U.S. cities. His victims were women of various ages, and for a long time, investigators were unable to establish a clear connection between these murders. In 1980, Lorette murdered 18-year-old Mary Fleming in St. Charles, Missouri. He attacked the woman as she was returning home from the store and, after attempting to rape her, killed her with several knife wounds. This murder was a turning point, as the police were able to establish a link between his actions and a number of other crimes committed earlier. After Lorette was identified as a possible suspect, he was arrested and subsequently confessed to several murders and assaults. During the investigation, it was discovered that Lorette may have been involved in murders in other states, which significantly increased the number of his victims. He confessed to his involvement in murders committed in Kansas, Florida, Louisiana, and other locations. Lorette's trial was lengthy and complex. He was charged with murder, and his actions were classified as premeditated and cruel. Prosecutors used his confessions and various pieces of evidence, including witness testimony and traces left at the crime scenes. After several years of legal proceedings, Lorette was found guilty of the murder of Mary Fleming and other crimes. As a result, he was sentenced to death. Lorette continued to fight the sentence, claiming that his actions were caused by personal problems and emotional trauma. But all of his appeals were rejected. He was executed on November 29, 1995, at the Potosi Correctional Center in Missouri, after spending nearly 15 years on death row. Before his execution, Lorette confessed to 31 murders and 10 rapes committed in 11 states. In his final statement, he apologized to himself and the families of his victims, saying, "I'm sorry it had to be this way." Robert Eugene Brashers, born on March 13, 1958, in Newport News, Virginia, and who became one of the most notorious serial killers in the United States, remained in the shadows for a long time, not being linked to the series of murders for which he was later found responsible. His name only became known years after his death, thanks to advances in genetic genealogy, which allowed investigators to link him to several unsolved murders. Brasher's murders, spanned the period from 1990 to 1998 and took place in several states, including Kentucky, Missouri, South Carolina, and Texas. Brashers was the younger of two children born to Dulles and Nancy Brashers. The family moved to Huntsville, Alabama, where Robert spent his childhood and adolescence. Although little is known about his childhood and teenage years, it is believed that he did not commit any crimes at an early age and did not have any problems with alcohol or drugs. After graduating from high school, he enlisted in the Navy, where he served for several years. In the early 1980s, Brashers left the military, moved to New Orleans, and then to Fort Myers, Florida, where he continued his life as a civilian. His first significant run-in with the law occurred in 1985, when Brashers was arrested in Port St. Lucie, Florida, on charges of assaulting a 24-year-old woman, Michelle Wilkerson. He met her at a bar and then took her to a dark alley where he attempted to rape her. When Wilkerson resisted, Brashers shot her. Despite her serious injuries, the woman survived, hid in a culvert, and gave a detailed description of her attacker, which led to his arrest. In 1986, Brashers was convicted and sentenced to 12 years in prison. However, thanks to good behavior, he was released early in 1989. After his release, Brashers became even more mobile and began committing crimes in various parts of the country, including South Carolina, Tennessee, and Georgia. In 1992, he was arrested again for car theft and illegal possession of a firearm. During a search, he was found in possession of a radio scanner, a police jacket, and lockpicking tools. After reaching a plea bargain with the prosecution, he pleaded guilty to car theft and was sentenced to 5 years in prison, which he served until 1997. After his release in 1997, Brashers continued to commit crimes, but investigators did not link him to murders and violence until a tragic event occurred in 1999. On January 13, 1999, police officers spotted a stolen car parked in a hotel parking lot in Kennett, Missouri. When they approached the car, Brashers opened fire, taking his family hostage. After 4 hours of negotiations, he released them and shot himself. Brashers died on January 19, 1999, from complications related to gunshot wounds. However, his name only became known decades later. In 2018, investigators were able to use genetic genealogy to identify him as a criminal linked to several murders committed between 1990 and 1998. One of the first murders investigated was the 1990 murder of Genevieve "Jenny" Zitricki in South Carolina. Zitricki was beaten, raped, and strangled with pantyhose. Genetic analysis revealed that Brashers' DNA matched samples found at the crime scene. This discovery was a turning point in the investigations, which determined that he was also linked to the murders of 38-year-old Sherry Scherer and her 12-year-old daughter Megan in 1998 in Missouri. Brashers' DNA also confirmed his involvement in the rape of a 14-year-old girl in 1997 in Memphis, Tennessee, as well as several other attacks in different states. In 2021, his trail was uncovered in a murder in Kentucky, but details of the crime were not disclosed at the time. Particular attention was drawn to a 1991 murder at a yogurt shop in Austin, Texas, where 4 teenagers, including 2 female employees, were killed, raped, and then burned. It was the analysis of DNA found at the crime scene that established his involvement. A DNA sample from Brasher, taken from his remains after he killed himself, matched a partial profile obtained during the investigation. Timothy Wayne Critchier was born on November 28, 1944, in West Mahanoy, Pennsylvania, to Charles McBride and Fern Yost. When he was 1 year old, his father left the family, and Timothy remained with his mother. She soon met Bernie Critchier, who became his stepfather. The family moved to other cities, including Harrisburg and New Milford, where Timothy spent his childhood. As a teenager, he began to exhibit deviant behavior, including theft, voyeurism, and exhibitionism. This behavior was only a precursor to his future crimes. Krejcir enrolled at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, where he studied administrative justice and psychology, but his life was not only marked by his studies. In 1962, at the age of 17, he enlisted in the U.S. Navy, but was discharged after 14 months of service following allegations of sexual assault. This was one of the first serious steps in his criminal career. After his military service, his life continued in a cycle of crime, including arrests for rape and assault, which led to numerous prison terms. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Krejcir was imprisoned several times, but each time he was released, he returned to his criminal activities. From the mid-1970s, he committed a series of violent crimes while traveling across the United States, particularly in the states of Missouri, Illinois, and Pennsylvania. His victims were women of various ages. In most cases, he followed the same pattern. He kidnapped, raped, and then killed his victim. The bodies were often found in places unrelated to his home environment, making it difficult to link the murders. One of his first known cases occurred on August 12, 1977, when the bodies of two women, Brenda and Mary Parch, were found in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. As a result of further investigations, investigators determined that Krejcir was linked to this crime, as well as a number of other murders in the same area, including the murders of Sheila Cole in 1977 and Virginia Lee Witt in 1978. These murders took place over several years and had similar characteristics. The victims were raped, bound, and then killed. However, at the time, the police did not have sufficient evidence to arrest Krejcir, and his actions remained unsolved. Many of Krejcir's victims were linked to sex crimes, and investigators were unable to establish a connection between all of his crimes for a long time. However, the lack of DNA technology and forensic methods at the time made it difficult to establish his identity. Moreover, his crimes were random in nature, and Krejcir operated in different cities, which only complicated the investigation. In 1982, he was arrested for several attacks and sentenced to prison. But even in prison, Krejcir did not stop his criminal activities. A few years later, he was released, but he returned to violence, committing new murders and rapes. After his arrest in 1983, Krejcir was sentenced to additional terms, but this did not prevent him from continuing his criminal activities. After his conviction in 2007, Krejcir was found guilty of the 1982 murder of 23-year-old Deborah Shepard, as well as the murders of other women, including those whose bodies were found in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. Confessions and DNA evidence found at the crime scenes formed the basis for his conviction. Krejcir confessed to the murders and was sentenced to multiple life terms without the possibility of parole. Charles Ray Hatcher, an American serial killer, was born on July 16, 1929, in Mount City, Missouri, to Jesse James and Lula Nevada Hatcher. His life was marked by violence and crime, and his brutal actions caused the deaths of many people in various states across the United States. Hatcher was the youngest of 4 children in the family, and his childhood was overshadowed by tragic events. In 1936, his older brother died from an electric shock when the copper wire they were playing with touched a high-voltage power line. His father, a violent alcoholic, left the family, leaving Hatcher with his mother, who remarried several times. Hatcher's early years were filled with violence and deviant behavior. He was aggressive towards those around him and was the subject of ridicule at school. However, this ridicule only strengthened his character and shaped his future criminal tendencies. At the age of 17, after graduating from school, Hatcher enlisted in the U.S. Navy, but his career was cut short when he was discharged for sexual assault in 1963. This was only the beginning of his criminal career, which would later lead him to commit numerous crimes. In 1947, Hatcher was convicted of car theft, which was his first serious offense. This led to his first prison sentence. However, this did not stop him, and he continued to commit crimes such as car theft, robbery, and other petty crimes. His life was filled with arrests, prison escapes, and periods of freedom during which he continued to commit violent acts. From the mid-1960s, Hatcher began to exhibit even more serious deviant tendencies. He began to be accused of sexual crimes, including abductions and rapes. One of his most notorious crimes was the kidnapping of a 12-year-old boy, William Freeman, in 1969. Hatcher claimed to have strangled the boy and also confessed to other murders he had committed over the years. Hatcher continued his criminal activities in various states, including California, Illinois, and Missouri, and remained unknown to the police until the late 1970s. His crimes became a serious problem for law enforcement agencies. Hatcher was linked to numerous disappearances and murders, but the evidence remained weak. He used various aliases and constantly changed his place of residence, making him difficult to detect. Some of his victims were found in terrible condition, many of them strangled or stabbed to death. Hatcher also confessed to several rapes and assaults on women and children. One of Hatcher's most notorious murders was that of 11-year-old Michelle Steele in 1982. After this crime, he was arrested and confessed to other murders committed in various states. During the investigation, Hatcher provided details about his crimes, which allowed investigators to link him to several murders that had previously remained unsolved. He also confessed to the 1978 murder of 4-year-old Eric Christian, whose body was found on the banks of the Missouri River. Hatcher was arrested and charged with several murders. In 1983, he was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. However, even after his arrest, his confessions continued. During interrogations, he told investigators about other victims he had killed. Hatcher's confessions also led to the release of an innocent man, Melvin Reynolds, who had been wrongfully convicted of murdering one of his victims. After his conviction, Hatcher continued his life in prison, where he was sentenced to life imprisonment for murder. However, his story ended tragically. On December 3, 1984, just days after he was sentenced for the murder of Michelle Steele, Hatcher was found dead in his cell. He was 55 years old at the time of his death. Donald J. Beardsley was born on May 13, 1943, in St. Louis, Missouri. He was the eldest of 3 children in a family marked by instability. His father died when Beardsley was 11, and from that point on, his life was marked by hardship. Beardsley's mother remarried several times, but family relationships remained fragile. At the age of 15, he was sent to a military school in Illinois, and then continued his education at a high school in St. Louis. After graduating from high school in August 1962, Donald enlisted in the U.S. Air Force, where he served for 4 years as an aircraft mechanic. However, his service was cut short when he was caught attempting to steal a car in 1965. This event was the first serious offense in his life, foreshadowing more serious crimes in the future. After being discharged from the military, Beardsley was imprisoned several times for car theft and other crimes. His behavior became increasingly deviant, and in 1969 he committed his first murder. He met 23-year-old Laura Griffin in a bar, invited her to his home, and after they drank and danced, he raped and murdered her. Beardsley strangled Laura, then stabbed and drowned her. He turned himself into the police and confessed to the crime. For this crime, he was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 19 years in prison. However, after serving only 7 years in prison, Beardsley was released on parole in 1977. This period of freedom became a time of new crimes for him. In 1981, he moved to California, where, while on parole, he was again involved in murders. Together with his roommate, Ricardo Soria, he organized the murders of 2 women, Patty Gedling and Stacy Benjamin. According to the indictment, Beardsley and his accomplices lured the women into the apartment, tied them up, and brutally murdered them. Beardsley and his accomplice, Bill Forrester, shot Gedling, and then Beardsley slit Benjamin's throat. The motive for the murders was an unpaid drug debt and a dispute with a drug dealer that led to the violence. When the police began their investigation, Beardsley's phone number was found near the body of one of the victims, leading to his arrest. During questioning, he confessed to the murders and revealed the location of Benjamin's body. In 1982, while still on parole for a murder in Missouri, Beardsley was convicted of 2 murders. He was sentenced to death as a repeat offender, which allowed the prosecution to seek such a severe punishment. After his arrest and guilty plea, the defense attempted to challenge the sentence, arguing that Beardsley suffered from a mental disorder. They cited a head injury he sustained in an accident on a farm in Minnesota, claiming that the injury could have affected his behavior. However, prosecutors pointed to his above-average intelligence and his ability to manipulate and commit violence, which proved his sanity. Beardsley was sentenced to death. After lengthy appeals and numerous clemency petitions that were denied, his execution was scheduled for January 19, 2005. Andrew Wessel Six was born on May 14, 1965, in Pershing, Iowa. At an early age, he faced numerous difficulties that affected his mental development. His childhood was marked by abuse and neglect from his parents, which set the stage for his future problems. Shortly after his birth, his parents divorced, and he was raised by his mother, who remarried several times. But the family situation remained extremely unstable. At school, Six suffered from a hearing impairment that went untreated for several years. These problems laid the foundation for further psychological and emotional difficulties in his life. From an early age, Six exhibited aggression and deviant behavior, which soon led to him being diagnosed with hyperactivity and depression. Already in his teenage years, he faced serious problems in communicating with those around him and with the authorities. Later, as an adult, these problems only worsened, and drug and alcohol abuse added antisocial personality disorder to the list. Throughout his life, he came into conflict with the law several times, starting with minor offenses and ending with serious crimes. One of the most tragic episodes in Six's life was the murder of a family in 1984. In April 1984, he was involved in a triple murder in Iowa, killing Justin Hook Jr., his mother Sarah Link, and their sister-in-law Tina Lade. The bodies of all 3 were found with head injuries, and the police quickly realized that the murders had been committed by one person. However, despite initial suspicions about Six, there was no evidence against him, and the case remained unsolved for several more years. Several years later, in 1987, Six committed another horrific crime, the kidnapping and murder of 12-year-old Katie Allen. He and his uncle, Donald Pittari, abducted the girl from her home in Iowa and transported her to Missouri, where they killed her. Katie's body was found a few days later in a ditch in a rural area. Medical examiners determined that she had died from stab wounds to the neck. This tragedy led to the arrest of Six and his uncle, who were found guilty of kidnapping and murder. Both were sentenced to death in Missouri and also received 200 years in prison on federal charges. The legal proceedings in Six's case were long and intense. In 1988, Six was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. This sentence was carried out on August 20th, 1997. The trial was complex, and despite numerous appeals and requests for clemency, the sentence remained unchanged. Six's final appeal was rejected by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1997, leading to his execution by lethal injection. Interestingly, several years after his execution in 2014, new technologies such as DNA analysis established that Six was also responsible for a triple murder that occurred in 1984. Robert Wesley Neaton, born on February 5, 1941, in Springfield, Missouri, had a rough and unstable childhood, which probably played a key role in his future criminal path. His mother, who had 8 husbands and numerous boyfriends, was unable to provide him with a normal upbringing. As a child, Neaton was subjected to physical and emotional abuse. His father was an alcoholic and treated him cruelly, while his mother would send him out onto the streets during holidays, if he reminded her of his father. Due to these terrible living conditions and subsequent abuse, Naughton became a victim of his own family, which may have affected his personality development. When he was only 12 years old, Naughton was sent to a correctional facility for boys, where he was often punished for the slightest misdemeanors with violence. His problems with the law continued throughout his life. In 1968, he was convicted of armed robbery in Oklahoma and sentenced to 10 years in prison. While in prison, Neaton began to develop criminal connections, and soon his life was once again in the hands of the justice system. In 1973, after his release from prison, Neaton was again at the center of a tragedy when he shot 53-year-old Claude Day and his son Coffee during a conflict that led to the death of the son. After that, Neaton kidnapped a young couple and their little daughter, threatening to kill the girl if they didn't do what he wanted. This incident ended with Neaton's arrest, but he was only found guilty of manslaughter and got 10 years in prison. While in prison, Neaton joined a white supremacist gang, which also influenced his future actions. The following years were a period of repeated crimes for Neaton, including murders. In 1989, while in a correctional facility in Kansas City, he began romantic relationships with 22-year-old Ruth Renee Williams and 17-year-old Lawrence Lingle Britton. In 1990, they drew him into criminal activity that led to a series of horrific murders and kidnappings. Naughton suggested that Britton and Williams commit robberies and murders. Soon, the trio escaped in a stolen van and set out on a trail of crimes they planned to commit. The trio committed murders in several locations, including the home of Frank Merrifield and his stepson Ray Donahue. They then continued south, where they stopped at the home of Richard and Virginia Denny and committed 2 murders. Nighton and Britton killed the couple despite their attempts to persuade them to spare their lives. The motive for these murders remains unclear, but Nighton stated that he did not want to kill people, even though he did so. As they continued on their way, they were stopped by a local resident who suspected something was wrong and called the police. Shortly thereafter, the trio was arrested and their crimes were uncovered. Neaton, Britton, and Williams were charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, and after a thorough trial, Britton and Williams pleaded guilty and testified against Neaton in exchange for reduced sentences. Neaton, despite pleas from his lawyers and numerous appeals, was found guilty and sentenced to death. His actions were so brutal that the death penalty seemed the only just decision. The prosecutors and judges who reviewed his case concluded that the aggravating circumstances outweighed the mitigating factors, and the death penalty was imposed. However, despite this, Nighton stated that he did not want children to suffer because of his actions. Nighton was executed on May 27, 2003, by lethal injection. Daniel Oliver Jones was born on September 26, 1969, in Kansas City, Missouri. His childhood was marred by numerous problems and difficulties, which likely played a role in his later criminal behavior. He attended Raytown South High School in Raytown, where he established himself as a troublemaker, frequently getting into trouble. However, the situation worsened when in 1987 he attacked his teacher, raping her and threatening to kill her. This incident was a turning point in Jones's life, and he was convicted of aggravated rape. He spent 8 years in prison before being released on parole in 1996. Shortly after his release, Jones returned to a life of crime. In December 1998, he murdered 19-year-old Janae Douglas. Jones attacked his former neighbor, stabbing her to death in her apartment. He left the scene of the crime and later, when the police were investigating the murder, even tried to show his pity by visiting the victim's mother and expressing his condolences. But the murder remained unsolved, and only after some time was a cash reward offered for information about the perpetrator. In 1999, just a few months later, Jones committed another murder. This time his victim was 21-year-old Kalika Gilliam. In this tragedy, Jones broke into the girl's apartment and carried out a brutal attack that ended in her death from 36 stab wounds. This act of violence was as brutal as his previous crimes. But despite this, the investigation did not lead to an immediate arrest. Then, in August 2000, Jones attacked 21-year-old Roxanne Colley, with whom he had a sexual relationship. During this attack, after Jones became angry over Roxanne's infidelity, he broke into her home, raped her, and killed her by slitting her throat. This murder was the last one committed by Jones in 2000. His actions became increasingly aggressive, and investigators began to notice similar methods of murder which suggested a serial killer. However, the culmination of Jones' crimes came in 2001. On March 6, 2001, he murdered 18-year-old Candrea White, a mother of two. White was found dead in her apartment after Jones broke into her home and, chasing his victim around the room, stabbed her to death before slitting her throat. Remarkably, on the day of the murder, the victim's two young children were in the next room and were unharmed. However, a neighbor noticed the door ajar and discovered White's body. After White's murder, Jones was arrested thanks to a palm print found at the crime scene that matched his records. During the investigation, his DNA was taken and used to link him to previous crimes. This led Jones to soon confess to the murders and other crimes. However, his defense put forward the theory that he had an alibi for the day of White's murder, and his family confirmed his presence that day. During the trial, he managed to create the appearance of an alibi. Nevertheless, prosecutors presented compelling evidence, and in 2002, Jones was found guilty of the murder of Candrea White. His confessions soon linked him to the murders of Janae Douglas, Kalika Gilliam, and Roxanne Colley. In April 2004, Jones confessed to all of the murders, which allowed him to avoid the death penalty. In response, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Lorenzo Jerome Gillard Jr., known as the Kansas City Strangler, was born on May 24, 1950, in Kansas City, Missouri. From an early age, his life was marked by disciplinary problems and aggressive behavior. He was one of 5 children born to Lorenzo Gillard Sr. and Laura Brown. During his school years, he often got into trouble. He was violent toward weaker children and became known as a bully. Due to poor grades and chronic truancy, Lorenzo was unable to complete his education, dropping out of school after 10th grade. These were the first signs of his deviant behavior, which would later lead him to more serious crimes. In 1968, at the age of 18, Gillard married Renee Hill after she became pregnant. However, their married life quickly became problematic. Gillard was violent, both physically and sexually, which eventually led to domestic violence and divorce. His violent tendencies only intensified, and he soon became the subject of criminal investigations. In 1969, he was arrested for assaulting and raping a woman, but the charges were dropped after a settlement agreement was reached between the parties. A few years later, in 1970, he was arrested again, this time for assaulting another woman, whom he allegedly choked unconscious. However, due to questionable testimony, the charges were again dropped. The next few years of Gillard's life were marked by multiple arrests for rape and assault. He was arrested in 1973 for assaulting his first wife, Rena Hill, and physically and sexually abusing her on several occasions. This led to divorce, but his criminal activity did not stop. In 1974, Gillard was arrested for raping a 25-year-old woman, but again the charges were dropped after an agreement between the parties. In 1975, after Gillard was convicted of sexual acts with the underage daughter of a friend, he received a 9-month sentence in Jackson County Jail. Gillard remarried after this, but this union also quickly fell apart as his second wife also became a victim of his violence. Gillard continued to lead a criminal lifestyle, and his arrests became more frequent. He was arrested for assaulting his third wife in 1979, and in 1981 he was back behind bars for theft and violating the terms of his parole. In the early 1980s, Gillard got a job with a garbage disposal service in Kansas City, and it was during this period that he began the series of murders for which he was later convicted. From 1977 to 1993, Gillard committed a series of murders. with at least 13 women and girls among his victims. All of his victims were found strangled, and most of them had been sexually assaulted. For a long time, the Kansas City police were unable to find a connection between the murders, as they occurred in different areas of the city and the victims were typically marginalized women and prostitutes. However, by 1994, law enforcement agencies began to link these murders together. In 2001, Kansas City received a federal grant to review unsolved cases using new DNA technology, which proved to be a turning point in the investigation. DNA samples taken from Guillard were matched to evidence found at the crime scenes, leading to his arrest in 2004. After his arrest, Guillard was charged with the murders of 6 women and linked to other unsolved cases. In 2007, Guillard was sentenced to life in prison without parole for the murders committed in the 1980s. One of the most notorious murders was the case of 36-year-old Sheila Ingold, who was found strangled in Kansas City in 1987. Guillard was also linked to murders committed in 1986 and 1987, when victims were found strangled in secluded locations, such as abandoned buildings and parking lots. Throughout the trial, he insisted on his innocence, but DNA evidence and police testimony convinced the jury of his guilt. Christopher Collins was born on December 17, 1969, in Kansas City, Missouri, into a family that seemed doomed to tragedy from the very beginning. His life, filled with violence, cruelty, and social deviance from childhood, led him to commit one of the most brutal crimes that shocked the entire country. Collins' early behavior, aggression, and antisocial tendencies were harbingers of the terrible events that would later unfold. From childhood, Christopher showed signs of cruelty and aggression. He was known for his hooliganism and cruel treatment of those around him. During his school years, his reputation as a troublemaker and bully grew, and by the age of 16, his life began to take a dark turn. His problems with the law began early, and he was involved in numerous incidents. Despite this, his behavior always went unpunished, and his loved ones did not realize the full extent of the problem. In 2007, when Collins was 37, his life finally took a tragic turn. He became the prime suspect in the murder of a girl that shook the country. 9-year-old Rowan Ford, the daughter of his girlfriend, was kidnapped, raped, and murdered. Collins, who lived with the Ford family and was acquainted with the girl, was found guilty of her murder. On that fateful day, according to the investigation, he abducted the girl, strangled her with a rope, and then dumped her body in an abandoned sinkhole near Powell, Missouri. After the murder, Collins attempted to cover his tracks by burning clothes and other evidence. However, he soon confessed to the crime and was arrested. During the investigation, he continued to claim that he was innocent and tried to shift the blame onto other people, including the girl's stepfather, David Spears. Spears in turn confessed to the crime and was convicted of participating in the murder, but Collins continued to deny his role. Despite his confessions and attempts to manipulate the investigation, the court found Collins guilty of first-degree murder. This crime was the result of years of attempts to manipulate people and use his power over others. He was found guilty not only of the kidnapping and murder of Rowena Ford, but also of a number of other crimes that were never solved, but which were made possible by his violent behavior. After lengthy legal proceedings, in which the Supreme Court rejected all appeals and requests for a review of the case, Collins was sentenced to death. For many years, his defenders tried to prove that Collins had a mental disorder and that his childhood had been marred by violence. However, these arguments did not change the verdict. On December 3, 2019, more than 12 years after the crime was committed, Christopher Collins was executed by lethal injection at the Bonne Terre State Prison. David Russell Hosier, born on February 10, 1955 in Indiana, was a man whose life was overshadowed by tragedy, mental illness, and crime. He grew up in a family where the violent loss of his father to murder left a deep scar on his psyche. His father, Glenn, was a police officer who died in 1971 when David was only 16 years old. This event shook him and left an indelible mark that, according to many, influenced his future behavior. His mother, struggling with her own grief, was unable to give her son and other children the attention they needed, which only exacerbated David's isolation during his teenage years. After school, Hosier enrolled in military school and later served in the U.S. Navy, where he worked in communications. Despite a successful military career, Hosier's mental health began to deteriorate. In 1986, he was diagnosed with depression with psychotic features and bipolar disorder. Against the backdrop of these problems, he began to have problems with the law. In 1992, he was arrested for assaulting his girlfriend, and despite being convicted, he was released on parole in 1997. However, problems with controlling his emotions and aggression continued to plague him, which became the catalyst for subsequent tragic events. On September 28, 2009, Hosier committed a crime that shocked the public. He shot his ex-girlfriend Angela Gilpin and her husband Rodney Gilpin in Jefferson City, Missouri. According to the investigation, the motive for the crime was Hosier's anger over Angela and Rodney's decision to rekindle their relationship after Angela and Hosier had been in a romantic relationship for a long time. Hosier could not come to terms with the end of his romance and decided to commit murder. After committing the murder, Hosier attempted to flee. He traveled to Oklahoma, but was soon arrested and extradited to Missouri. During the investigation, police found evidence that Hosier had repeatedly threatened Angela, and it was also discovered that his mental state was a significant factor that contributed to the tragedy. Notes were found in his car in which he described his plans for revenge and the rage he felt after Angela returned to her husband. The trial began in 2010, and Hosier was charged with first-degree murder. He pleaded not guilty, claiming that he did not commit the murder. However, after an extensive investigation and the presentation of evidence such as threats and testimony, Hosier was found guilty. In 2013, the jury recommended the death penalty. After the verdict, Hosier filed several appeals in an attempt to overturn the death sentence. All of his appeals were rejected, starting with local courts and ending with the U.S. Supreme Court. He argued that his mental state, related to depression and the effects of a stroke, was sufficient grounds for leniency, but the courts did not accept these arguments. In 2019, after another appeal was rejected, Hosier realized that his fate was sealed. On June 11, 2024, after 11 years on death row, Hosier was executed by lethal injection at the Missouri Eastern Reception, Diagnostic and Correctional Center. The day before his execution, he filed a clemency petition, citing his trauma from the loss of his father and his military service. However, Missouri Governor Mike Parson denied his petition, stating that Hosier had never shown remorse for his violent actions.